Good morning, all. Appreciate everybody coming out on a wet Sunday morning. Welcome to our study of Galatians. If you do not have material this morning, will you please raise your hand? We got several copies, and I think someone in the back can help with that. Brad is ready. Anybody need a copy of our material? Okay. If you do decide you'd rather have a digital copy, I think that is on the scoop, so you're welcome to grab that if you prefer to work digitally. But we'll work through our class on Galatians this quarter, and I appreciate your help with that as we study together. I wanted to begin very briefly, just a couple of housekeeping things on class. On pages 2 and 3 of your material is the plan of attack. I do kind of like everybody to know where we're going, what passages we'll be studying. If you are forced to miss a class or two, you'll know where to pick back up, and so we will do our very best to stay to that schedule. One of the things you'll note is we have class today and we have class Wednesday, and then there'll be a week break for our gospel meeting, and so we really kind of do hopefully a full introduction, and then we all get a week to marinate on it, and then we'll come back together. When we come back after our gospel meeting, we're really going to spend the next 2 or 3 weeks in the book of Acts. There's so much about at least the first 2 chapters of Galatians that really kind of force us to understand a little bit about Paul's journeys through the region and a little bit about his own background. He weaves that into the letter to these churches, and so we'll spend a few weeks in Acts reviewing some of that before we dive into kind of a more textual study of the book, which will take us through kind of the last 2 months of the quarter. You can see there's a couple of maps and a couple of timelines in the front. The timelines there on pages, what are those? Pages 5 and 6. Those are guaranteed to be inaccurate. There's just no way to do that with 100% accuracy in my judgment without some kind of divine guidance, which I did not have. You can, from secular history and following the biblical record, you can get really close, I think, on a lot of these things, but there is a lot of conjecture. One of the things we'll talk about is, I don't know how we can know with any certainty when this book was written. So you'll see there's a couple of question marks. And we'll talk about some of those things as we go through. But those are truly my invention, and so they are for directional, trying to be correct directionally. Specifics I would not put much stock in. And the maps will be helpful as we begin our conversation today. As you get into the lessons, you'll notice there's a lot of white space. There's not a lot of narrative in the book. That's by design. I truly do want this to be interactive. There's only a handful of questions in each lesson. That is so you can think about those things. I think everybody in here is beyond yes or no and fill in the blank type questions. We're going to try to ask questions that kind of force us to get into the text and, what is going on here and what are the implications of this and what does it mean? And so your participation is definitely solicited. You can see there's not a lot of just, there's only a handful of questions. If it's just me answering them, this is going to go really quickly and be really awkward for everybody. We will stare at each other. So please bring your thoughts and your questions. And so I will note that this morning's lesson is a little less in the text, and I apologize for that. Don't give up on me. We will certainly dive into the text beginning on Sunday. So as we begin our quarter in this study, will you go with me in prayer, please? Lord, thank you for the blessing of being here this morning and for the blessing of being able to engage with your text. We pray that the things that we study this quarter, even though we're studying about people a long way from us geographically and a long way from us chronologically, that we know that we have the same, we have a lot of the same tendencies and issues that your people have had through the generations, and help us through the study of this book and seeing what our brothers were going through at that time, help us be able to better handle the situations that we deal with in our present day. I pray that you give us wisdom and insight, keep us on the path, help defeat us when we get off the path. In all things, we pray that we can be better soldiers in your kingdom for the work that we do here together this quarter. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you. So let's go to lesson 1. That's on page 9, and I hope that you had an opportunity to look at some of these questions. And I also hope that you had an opportunity just to read through the book of Galatians. And I don't know how often we do that, just kind of start from the beginning of the book and read through. Remember, that was how they were originally intended to be consumed. It was a letter. It was intended to be read that way. I timed it last night. It was a 22-minute read for me. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that's fast or slow, but that's what it means. And so it's not an overwhelming text that you can't read all at once. And one of the things that I would ask everyone to do as we get ready for for class on Wednesday, read the book of Galatians. If you've already done it, do it again. All the way through chapter 1 to chapter 6. And I'll mention this again at the end, but I would ask everybody to keep some kind of notepad or note-taking device as you read through it. When you catch something that you think is interesting, when you say, this is noteworthy, what does this mean? This is interesting, this is a theme, jot it down, please. We're going to all do that together. And as the intent of the class is, we're going to look at the book as a whole first, and then really dig into its parts. And I hope that we find that to be useful. If we kind of recognize the themes early, here's what we're going to be talking about, and then as we get further into the quarter, we'll dive into the specifics. So that's the goal, and we'll see how we do. So I ask for your help with that. But on page 9, we'll just begin with question 1. And that is, why do you think the book of Galatians is sometimes overlooked or underappreciated? Now, when I ask that question, just to be clear, I've got some evidence that this book is perhaps underappreciated. Here's my evidence. All right, so this is kind of interesting. I know the elders have kept track of all of the classes, all the adult Bible classes that have been held at Southside. This goes back at least to 2010, I think. And it goes on, as you can imagine, it's got the Old Testament and non-book, kind of themes and topics. But I just cut out the New Testament section. And one of the things that stood out to me is I guess Dad and I were looking at this last year, but somehow the book of Galatians is not specifically, obviously themes in the book of Galatians have been covered many times, but the book of Galatians as a whole has not been covered in, I don't know, however long this goes back. That's interesting to me that, throughout this time, different men of the congregation have made choices about which books that they were going to tackle. Some of you brave people tackled Romans. I was going to make fun of Darren this morning. He wasn't like there were some really challenging choices that were made here, and yet we haven't touched the book of Galatians. And so that I guess that's kind of what leads to question 1. As you think about the letters that Paul wrote, do you think that the book of Galatians is maybe overlooked or underappreciated or not talked about as much as the other letters? And if so, why is that? Somebody help me with that one. Okay, good. We've got the first question of the class. Carol doesn't agree with me. You're setting me up for a long quarter, Miss Carol. Okay, tell me how you don't agree.
Well, I think maybe we overlook studying the whole book because it's a subject of so many sermons.
I like that. Kyle beat it to death, and we didn't think we needed to study it.
It's a wonderful book.
It is a wonderful book.
And to me, it is. Now, I'm putting this in quotes.
Yes, ma'am?
It's Paul selling the new covenant.
Yes.
Jesus Christ.
Ooh, that is really good. If you'd have said that a week ago, it would have been the title of this book.
Just call me.
Shame on me. Paul selling the new covenant, which is really a great kind of overview of what is happening in the book of Galatians. And I will note that Kyle did do a sermon series through the book of Galatians, and I didn't mean to imply that it hadn't been touched on. We had whole classes on the fruit of the Spirit, and so there's definitely themes in there that have been touched on, but as a book as a whole, we haven't touched on. So that's good. That's good feedback. Yes, ma'am.
From one of our other classes from when we were at Bowling Green, we studied Galatians.
Yes.
I have written that sometimes it's called a condensed Romans.
Ooh, okay.
So it's like a continuation of what you see in the book of Romans.
Okay. That's very good. So another way to kind of think about the book as a whole or as an overview. What might make I'm not going to think of another way to ask the question. Is there any reason that this book is maybe looked over or we don't think about it as often? Any other reason somebody might think of?
It deals heavily with Jewish tradition and Jewish law that we aren't under.
Yes. So Kyle notes what I had listed as the first one is sometimes it may feel like the themes of Galatians aren't particularly relevant. As we talk about next week, the major themes of Galatians, it's what Carol mentioned is he was selling or selling the Galatians on the new covenant. I don't know how many people are going to be in the class on Wednesday that need to be sold on the new covenant, right? And so that theme might seem not as relevant to us as some themes of the issues they're dealing with in Corinth or the issues they're dealing with in Rome. They may not seem as relevant. So what are some of, under the umbrella of selling the Galatians on the new covenant, what are some of the themes that Paul touches on in the letter? Just briefly. We'll dig into more of these on Wednesday, but just briefly, what falls under that heading? Faith, for sure. Now that's relevant to us, for sure. What's that? Touches on the Holy Spirit. That's relevant to us.
Freedom from the law.
Freedom from the law, okay? And that's a really interesting one. We're going to talk a lot about what does that mean, and sometimes is that misapplied. Freedom from the law and freedom from law might be two different things, and I think that sometimes there's some convenient oversight of what Paul is really trying to say there at times. You had a comment? Okay, circumcision. That is, there's a lot of discussion in the book about that topic, and again, it might not seem particularly relevant. I think you'll see that the specific issue might be relevant. The themes about the issue really are. About keeping feast days, about conversing with Gentiles, right? All those topics, perhaps this is why it seems overlooked. Those topics don't feel as relevant. Judaizing teachers is not something that we might necessarily battle as a congregation here. I hope that you find that the themes, although the specific issue might not be something we battle, the lessons we learn are very, very relevant. So that's one. Maybe perhaps the themes seem obtuse or not particularly relevant. Why else might this book be uncomfortable for us?
Written from a perspective that you don't believe Paul's worth listening to.
Okay.
And we typically accept that he is.
Yes, good. So Kyle notes that kind of a tone or a theme of the overall book is that Paul is defending the fact that he is worth listening to and that his teaching is authoritative. And again, as Kyle notes, I'm not sure that is an issue that perhaps we have at large, right? Like, who is this Paul guy? Why are we worried about what he has to say? It's not specifically an issue we would deal with. It's a major theme in the book of Galatians. So, good. Very good. What else about Galatians?
He tells us that we're adopted into God's family.
Adoption is very relevant, right? So we'll talk about that theme for sure. Very relevant.
He He makes deep arguments. The arguments are hard to follow sometimes. It makes you, when you read through chapter 4 and kind of get a little bit lost in everything, it makes you want to just say, I'll come back to that.
So Kyle notes that the arguments are pretty deep at times, and we'll take a moment to step back. We're going to take it in small chunks as we go through the class to think about these ideas. Specifically, what would they mean to someone with a Jewish background in instances? I think it's very relevant. Steve?
Not get into a lot of details about it, but to Carol's point about the gospel being defended, the theme of the Jews and the Gentiles being completely equal.
Yes. Yes. An incredibly important theme in Galatians. An incredibly important theme in the New Testament seems distant to us, right? Maybe feels distant to us, but I think it's very relevant. Yes, sir.
The book is the book as a whole. Sometimes I think it's a good point brought up. We never seem to want to read it unless it's in piecemeal form.
Yeah.
So chapter 5 is one we hammer.
5 gets hammered. Absolutely.
Flesh versus spirit.
Yes.
And we very much relate to.
Yes.
So when I hear sermons, they're not, once again, that's not saying people haven't called up church, they have.
Yes.
But that one seems to come back to, like, let's go through the things we can't do, the things we can do, try to put this together, or whatever, everything. You know, the common battle of flesh versus spirit, which all links to the whole book.
Yes.
But we sometimes keep it in chapter 5.
Well said. And I think one of the really, really powerful things as we dig into it is that is a powerful chapter on its own. In the context of what he's saying, I think maybe it will become even more meaningful. Really good.
I think one thing that's interesting is how Paul really is aggravated.
Okay.
He calls them foolish.
Yes.
How quick they've gone from another gospel to said how they've been deceived, easily deceived.
Yes.
He seems like he's really frustrated with folks.
So Dad notes that Paul seems frustrated. It's one of the questions we'll talk about next time is the tone of the letter. And I hope that you, as you read through, see if you agree with that notion that Paul seems frustrated. There are some scholars who you will find who will believe that these Galatian churches, again, I don't know that we know for sure, but they believe that these Galatian churches really never got back on track. It's interesting that as Paul talks about the places that he was collecting for the saints, he says in 1 Corinthians, I told the churches of Galatia, right? We read that repeatedly as we talk about the collection. He says, I told the churches of Galatia, lay something aside on the first day of the week. When you get to 2 Corinthians and he talks about the places that he went and collected, Galatia is not mentioned. Again, don't want to draw too much from that, but as he later, in Paul's later writings, these churches don't seem to be referenced as the churches of Galatia send their greetings, or I gathered from the churches of Galatia. We don't see that. Paul was definitely frustrated at these brethren. And so you might note how that comes across in the tone of the book. So interesting, good comment.
Michael, I noticed that you didn't give thanks for these Christians.
Yeah, there are a couple of things, like very brief in the beginning of the book about grace and peace be with you, but he doesn't give the flowery paragraph about how he thanks God for them. Like none of that deeply in my prayers often kind of language. Not that Paul doesn't care, but I think it speaks a little bit to the tone. And one of the things perhaps that makes this book feel a little distant is who does he personally call out, or who does he personally send greetings to in this letter? Zero, right? There's no personal greetings, which kind of leads to maybe the next reason this might feel a little impersonal or feel a little different. Where is the city of Galatia?
It's today.
It's not a city, right? So that's important. This is kind of the only letter that we know for sure, perhaps Romans to some extent, but this book for sure is written to a region of churches, right? Which gives it a little bit of a different feel, perhaps. It's not to a specific group. You can feel the attachment of Paul to the brethren in Philippi, and we know some of those brethren right? We know the jailer. We know Lydia. We know people that he mentions by name in that book. There is a close connection. This seems a little more distant. This is written to a region of churches, and no one is mentioned by name. And perhaps, again, one of the reasons we're a little more uncomfortable with this book is just our unfamiliarity with the geography. I should have vetted this, but this is an experiment. So, how many people in this room have been to Rome? Okay, there's a decent amount of hands. How many people in this room have been to Greece? Okay, there's a decent amount of hands. How many people in this room have been to Yalvac, Turkey? There was only really one opportunity. This is part of the world that we're a little less familiar with. We've seen, I don't know, hundreds of pictures of Rome and ancient Rome and the stories of Rome. We know where Rome is. We got a feel for Greece and where Corinth is and where Philippi is. If I were to ask you to fill out the dots on that map, Miss Carol, this is just a map of modern-day Turkey with some of the dots that are very relevant to Paul's journeys through that territory. If I asked myself to label that map on like a 7th grade geography experiment, I would fail miserably. I might get one. Anybody want to take a swing at that one just here publicly in front of everybody? This is just geography we're not as familiar with. Kyle wants to show off a little bit. Which one?
I thought you were saying you could get Ephesus.
I might get Ephesus. I might get Ephesus right here. On a really good day, I might have told you that was Antioch. But these cities that we believe most likely make up the recipients of some of these churches and some of the other places in the area, again, we're just not as familiar with this geography. And one more thing about the book, I feel strongly that these are the churches that are being addressed in this book, but that is not 100% the consistent answer of every biblical scholar. There are some who would tell you that Galatia is really up here in the northern part of Turkey and that Paul is writing to churches that we don't know anything about in the book of Acts. Seems a little far-fetched to me. There are some arguments for that. Seems a little far-fetched to me. We're going to proceed in this class under the assumption that when Paul is talking about the churches of Galatia, that he's talking about these churches that he visited on his, what we would call his first preaching journey or his first missionary journey. Cities of Lystra, the city in Antioch, Iconium, Derbe, and maybe Perga. I'm going to, when we talk about the churches of Galatia, those are the 4 or 5 churches that I am going to be thinking about specifically. So again, maybe it's the geography we're just not as familiar with. We don't know much about central Turkey. In fact, today there's only really one of those cities that is of any consequence. There's a city called Konya. I think I'm saying that right, or at least in the neighborhood of that. There where Iconium is. Otherwise, though, there's archaeological, remains of some of these cities, but there's no real cities of consequence in those specific areas. So, there's a few reasons why Galatians might feel a little distant to us. So our goal for this quarter is to bring that back in, get familiar with this place and with these people. I hope going through the background of Acts will do that for us. So I hope that leads us to question 2. Anything else for question 1, by the way?
The Gauls, the Sabbath were taken.
That is just setting me up. I love it. Setting me up. So who were these Galatians? This is way more than you want to know about who the Galatians are. Let's talk about it real quick. Who were the Galatians? So there's a map on the screen of all of the Roman provinces about the time of Augustus. Okay, so roughly about the time same time frame we're looking at, how Rome divided up its empire. These were shifting all the time, and to say that this is the answer would be foolish. But this is again, directionally, this is a picture. The highlighted one, and you got the same map in your book, the highlighted area is an area the Roman province of Galatia. And it, like a lot of boundaries, it was a little bit arbitrary, right? It was a gerrymandered province. It wasn't like built on strict river boundaries or strict ethnic boundaries. It was just kind of cobbled together by Augustus. Okay, we're in central modern day Turkey. If there's questions or comments or things I'm messing up, please let me know. All right, how did we even get the name Galatia? More than you wanted to know here. It all starts with the Celts. The Celts were a people from Central Europe, pretty dominant ethnicity back in the Middle Ages, the Iron Ages, and they spread out in Latin. When you talk about a Celt, they referred to them in France as Gauls. The language as they moved to Ireland was Gaelic. Okay, you can see how Latin kind of phrases that. And so when they migrated into central Turkey, the Gauls became the Galatians. Okay, so we got this specific ethnicity of Celts who are migrating into Turkey. I told you it's way more than you wanted to know. And we're about 300 BC, and we got this migration of people into central Turkey. Warring people, they were probably brought in by a king who wanted their help, and so, several thousand of these migrate, and they set up camp here in kind of central Turkey. There's a little more to the story, but that's the guts of it. And then in 25 BC, it was organized or officially became a Roman province. And this is kind of a map of that area from about that time. And you can see it's got an odd little shape. It's kind of the S shape because of other agreements and just the way things happen politically. Again, this is not a strict, like the boundary of a river on one side and a river on another side. This is just kind of politically how it came together in this odd little S shape. The thing that some scholars find challenging is that the people who would have most likely called themselves Galatians, who were truly of that Celtic origin, were really up here in the northern part of the province. And that's why you see, even if you look at this map, that the province is named Galatia. You see that's in the large letters going all the way across the province. But then there's separately this little area that kind of ethnically, this is called Galatia too. So that's kind of the center of where these ethnically Galatian people lived. Down here in the south, these really wouldn't have been of the same ethnicity at all. These were Greeks and native, people from the native area and Jews and a little more of a melting pot. But because of the Roman province, because Rome called that whole area Galatia, that's the reason that these are Galatian churches, at least in my judgment. And you can see it's an odd little shape, and the boundaries are kind of arbitrary. One of the things that you might find interesting is this Antioch. And by the way, there's Antiochs everywhere. Why are there Antiochs everywhere in the first century? Because of a ruler, right? So Antiochus, to your own study. But there's a reason why there's Antiochs popping all over the place. So this Antioch of Turkey, we'll call it, it was a Roman colony. At least it became a Roman colony, 25, a little later BC. Being a Roman colony was kind of a big deal. You might remember that Philippi was a Roman colony. Luke mentions that specifically in the book of Acts. This also was a Roman colony. It meant that there was some Roman protection, that there would have been some Roman military there, likely some ex-military that were sent there to kind of formulate the Romanness of the area. Just might be interesting to keep that in mind. Is that why Paul feels comfortable there as a Roman citizen? But Antioch is a Roman colony. These cities These cities during this time were at least somewhat important, because if you wanted to go from the west coast of Turkey, you want to say Ephesus, which is a pretty significant trading center, right? If you wanted to get from Ephesus and work your way east, the road that you would travel, if you didn't want to travel by sea, like during sometimes the year you probably would travel by sea, but if it was a time of the year where sea travel wasn't safe, or if you didn't have the means to travel by sea, you would travel by a road that traveled through Antioch, through Iconium, through the Cilician Gates, as they're called, through Tarsus, and then down into kind of modern day Palestine. That road was at least somewhat significant. There would have been some travelers on that road. These cities wouldn't have been huge cities, but they were of some size. They were of some commercial importance because of that road that went through there. So, again, that's probably more than you want to know about Galatia. It really is divided into a northern and a southern. There are pretty significant cities up here in the northern part of Galatia. This Ankara is modern-day Ankara. That would be the capital of Turkey today. There's some pretty significant cities in the north. There's some pretty significant cities in the south. Geographically, the middle of this area there's no cities. There weren't any cities then. There's really not any now. It's barren, kind of salt marsh. It's not conducive to a really great place to live. So it really is divided into north and south. Again, at least this class is going to operate under the assumption that when Paul is writing the Galatians, he's writing to these brethren down here in the south. You wouldn't find 100% agreement on that. I don't know if you find 100% agreement on anything. You won't find 100% agreement on that, but makes the most sense, at least as I see it. Thoughts, questions, additions, contradictions? Help me.
For the Hittites reign, and of course during the time of the Egyptian reign, the Hittites were here.
Yes.
They basically completely went away. And then these all Celtics come into the area. But with Antioch, just an additional note is that Antiochus,
Yes.
the Seleucids actually extended their power all the way to mid-Turkey, and of course they fought the whole of these during the interbiblical period. So
Yes.
that's an important name for that period of time.
Yeah, so that Antioch and this Antioch for an important leader kind of in the inter-biblical time as the Greeks had significant influence. Any questions about or thoughts about kind of the geography, the area that we're talking about?
Maybe I could read this from the dates, but how long had these churches been in? Paul established them during his first missionary trip.
Yes.
When was this letter written? How long was there a period between them following the letter?
Great question. There is some debate about when this letter was written. It's certainly true these churches weren't very old. They couldn't have been very old, right? But if you take an early date, and we can go back to the timeline if you want to take a peek at this. If everybody wants to turn back to page 5. Again, all dates wrong or your money back. This is 100. But this is just directionally correct here. We hope. That first journey, if you kind of look on the timeline, that first journey before the kind of meeting in Jerusalem in Acts 15, which will be very important to us, but that first journey that we read about in Acts 13, Acts 14, is probably 46 to 49, that neighborhood AD, okay? Most people would tell you that there's two kind of main schools of thought on when the book was written. Either it was written right before the events of Acts 15, which would make the churches very, very young, less than 2 years old. That's kind of the early date idea. Or perhaps the book was written a little later during the third journey or during the beginning of the third journey, which would make these churches 8 to 9 years old. I would lean toward the second, just because of some Acts 15 issues that we'll dig into later in the class, but they're not very old. It could be that they're very, very young, but they hadn't been around for decades, for sure. And I don't know if anybody has any additional thoughts or comments or insights on that. We'll get into the dating a little bit. But one of the things that makes it difficult is there's no real mile markers in here to tell us exactly where it was written. But they're not that old. But one of the things we will note is interesting, even if it's that very, very young date, the less than 2-year-old churches, what does Paul note specifically about, is it one or at least two of these individual congregations in Acts 14, about their leadership? They had elders, right? Very, very young congregations had elderships. So, Luke? I'm almost sure you had your hand up.
I did.
Okay.
No, I think it's kind of a follow-up to Carol's point. I was thinking about this a while ago. He's already been through here. Why is he having to reestablish who he is? Why what he said means something, which could tie into him being so young, because it says in chapter 1. Verse 7, he's talking about no other gospel. He says, not that there's another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel. So, could there be some truth to, there's still that youth of spiritual growth that anybody that comes in and says, oh yeah, I know what this means, or this is what this means. Just youth in that sense too.
No question. No, it's a good thought. And to add to that, why does Paul have to reestablish who he is? And by the way, that's a major theme he takes pretty much 2 chapters trying to just establish who he is. Let me think of the right way to phrase this. If you're a new Christian who happens to be of a Jewish descent, who do you think could come to you with a teaching and you would be apt to, or at least lean toward listening to it? Who would it? Would it be some random person? Where would they come from? Who would you listen to? Jews. From where? If someone came to you from Jerusalem, and specifically if they said, hey, we were sent by James, the brother of Jesus, and they brought a false teaching, that would be, you can at least sympathize a little bit with why that might be difficult to deal with. And Acts 15 is very clear that that's happening in some places. Those were sent from James. Now, we don't know the Galatian churches were being affected by this specifically, but we know the issue is out there, that there were brethren who said they were from James who were preaching something that flat out wasn't true and led to these kind of issues. And maybe it's that kind of thing Paul's addressing. Yes?
Well, and just a couple points to those points that have been made. Verse 6, he says, I'm amazed that you are so quickly deserting.
Yes.
You know, how long does it have, how much time has to pass for it to be quick?
Yes.
I think that would give maybe credence to an earlier view of the letter. And also a lot that he deals with, it's probable that it's Gentiles who are having their minds taken away, not Jews.
Yeah.
And so instead of it being even though we know that the Jewish teachers are going to come and are going to persuade people, I wonder if some of their past religious background leads into this. You know, you mentioned they are Celtic, they are Gauls. We're going to see examples of them believing the pagan, myths of various gods. And then what do those various gods do? They protected their people. And Paul does not look like a protected person. And could it be that as people come to them, not only is it who gave this guy authority to go do these things, but look at this guy. He doesn't look like somebody with authority.
Yeah. So if you weren't able to hear all that, Kyle notes there were definitely Gentiles in this congregation. I don't know that we know the proportion, but we might talk a little bit about that as we read through the book of Acts. There were Jews and Gentiles, so we come from a diversity of backgrounds into this. And if you did have a pagan background, and that background included this idea that the gods kind of protect their own, Paul is not a good candidate for that, right? He admits in this book that he came to them the first time because he was sick. We don't really know what that means, but the very first time they heard Paul, in some way he was sick. And as they've heard other stories about the things that happened to him, again, would he be a figure that had to reaffirm who he was? So again, we'll see that theme very strongly in the first couple of chapters of Galatians. I had one other point that escaped me. Yes, sir.
But do you think that Paul's first missionary journey here had anything to do with this being approximately where he's from? He's not far from these places that we go to, although he doesn't seem to point out that he went to Tarsus, but that happened in his backyard.
I completely agree. And so John makes the point as we get into Acts and think about why didn't he just start in the biggest cities? Why didn't he go to Rome first? Why didn't he go to Ephesus first? Perhaps one of the reasons is these were a familiar area, right? Paul, we know, was from Tarsus. You can see that kind of in southeast. I'm not going with directions. In southeast on the map here of Turkey. And so we're not far from this kind of central part of what would be modern day Turkey. And again, there was a pretty established trade path that would have gone directly through Tarsus and through these cities. So by the way, there's a pretty significant mountain range right through here, just on the other side of Tarsus, with a narrow pass, kind of the only way to get into central Turkey, called the Cilician Gates. That little pass was very important militarily, as you can imagine. If it's kind of the only way down to Palestine, like that being a choke point for travel is hugely important. It became hugely important militarily. So that travel from that area right into Tarsus, Paul certainly knew of people, or at least knew of the area of Galatia. So that's an excellent point. Why did Paul start here? It was a little more comfortable. And at least the question, before they went to Galatia, Paul and Barnabas went to Cyprus, right? That's really where the first journey really started, was in Cyprus. Why would they have gone to Cyprus? Where Barnabas was from. So they started in places that had some familiarity on this first journey. At least that's the way it appears. Good point.
Another quick thing is that after Paul's converted, I think he goes to Tarsus for at least several years.
Yes.
Maybe that's the reason why that city's not included in his first missionary journey.
In fact, when Barnabas goes to get Saul and bring him to Antioch, if you remember that, and we'll talk about that verse in the book of Acts, where's he go get him? Go gets him in Tarsus, when got him and brought him to Antioch. And Antioch gets the no respect award, in my judgment. Like, we think about all these New Testament churches because they got books of the New Testament named after them. Antioch is, like, we're going to talk a lot in the first couple of chapters about Antioch. What a powerful and impactful group that was. They deserved a book. That's my thought. They deserved a book. Not fair they didn't get a book. Is that two bells? So questions for next class, these are in the book, but if you don't have a copy of the book or you don't have it with you, please go through and read the 6 chapters of Galatians. Take those notes of things that you find interesting. We'll talk more about the themes that pop up. We'll talk more about the tone of the letter. I'm sure we'll talk in some more detail about some of the things we talked about this morning. And what struck you as noteworthy. Again, based on some of the things we've already talked about where these people are from and where this area of the world is, what struck you as noteworthy about the letter. Thank you for being part of the class. I hope that hope you find it worthwhile for your walk, and I look forward to a good quarter.